This is a PC that would have been considered quite high-end in 2014. Let's see if it still holds up in 2020 and if it can still play the latest games. The CPU in here is an Intel Core i7-4790 with 4 cores, 8 threads, 3.6 GHz base clock, 4.0 GHz max turbo, no overclocking on the Haswell architecture with a HD 4600 iGPU, all on the 22nm process. Since it is an i7 with 4 physical cores and hyperthreading, performance should still be respectable. It's even Cyberpunk 2077's recommended CPU. The motherboard it sits on is a Gigabyte H97M D3H, and RAM overclocking is not supported. It's very much a board from 2014 featuring 2 PCI slots, no M.2 storage, no USB-C, no RGB, no fancy design, really nothing over the top, as most boards from the era were. We'll pair the board with 16GB of 1600MHz DDR3, very standard for the time. Our graphics card is an AMD R9 280X from MSI, which is a reincarnation of the HD 7970 released in 2012 as AMD's flagship GPU. This is the exact same thing, just re-released under a different name in 2014 as a mid-high-end offering. It has 2048 stream processors on the 28nm GCN 1.0 architecture, and it's clocked at 1000 MHz exactly. There are 3GB of GDDR5 VRAM at 1500 MHz, and this card overall was a huge power hog, having a 250W TDP and taking 8 plus 6-pin PCIe power. This particular MSI variant, I think, looks very pretty, simple and premium. This combo in 2014 would have been solidly mid to high-end, with a top-of-the-line non-K CPU and a second-tier GPU with 16GB of RAM. The only parts of the system that we used that were inauthentic are that we ran the games off of SSD storage, which would have cost a fortune back in 2014, and that we used a Wi-Fi AC adapter, which was very advanced technology for the time. Starting with synthetic CPU benchmarks, Cinebench R15 gave a multi-core score of 770 and a single core of 165. Not super impressive, mainly due to the low clock speed, but it holds up well enough to modern CPUs like the Ryzen 3 3100 or Intel Core i3 10100 that do just a little bit better. In Cinebench R20, the multi-core score was over 1800, meaning AVX performance of this CPU is not lacking. The memory in IDA64 had a read speed of 25,000 MB per second, about half of modern DDR4 3600. Memory latency was 63.4 nanoseconds at auto timings, about comparable with modern Intel CPUs and lower-end RAM. In Prime 95 small FFTs, 10 amps were going into the VRM on 12 volts for 120 watts, meaning VRM losses, the CPU was consuming just over 100 watts or so. Since the GPU can be overclocked, we applied a fair 10% overclock on the core to 1100 MHz, and since we did have Samsung VRAM, we turned the memory clock all the way up to 1750 MHz. In Unigine heaven, with the extreme preset at stock settings, the GPU gave 1121 points, and when overclocked it gave 1272 points, meaning a 14% speed boost. In games, this combo performed admirably, especially in older titles. In GTA 5 1080p high at stock frequencies, the GPU gave 76 FPS average, and with an overclock a small boost up to 81. The CPU was not nearly at max potential, which is ideal, and in CSGO at 1080p high, the stock GPU gave us 168 FPS average, but with an overclock that figure jumped almost 10% to 184 FPS average. The next few games were tested using stock GPU frequencies. Fortnite at the 1080p high preset ran well too. It gave a very smooth 71 FPS average with very little stutter when jumping from the bus. Far Cry 5 ran well as well. At 1080p high, the GPU could put out 57 frames per second on average without breaking a sweat. Dialing in overclock would surely bring this to an even 60. Now for the star of the show, the definitive game of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077. This game represents a massive leap in GPU performance requirements, but our R9 280X still held up. At 1080p low, unfortunately, 30 FPS was just not attainable even with low graphics settings, giving around 25 FPS average. But at 720p, the average jumped up to around 40 overall, which is very playable for an RPG game like Cyberpunk. Exploring the huge open city still allowed us to enjoy 30 FPS on average. Yet I can't shake the feeling that these figures are rather low, since the R9 280X is comparable to a modern 1050 Ti and it still has 3GB of VRAM. 30 FPS sometimes at 720p low is really lower than I expected. Note that we did use the latest AMD recommended drivers as of December 12th. So this combo has held up really well after 6 years, more like 8 years for the GPU. The CPU is chugging along without breaking a sweat in games, and the GPU is putting out great frame rates across the board, with the sole exception of Cyberpunk 2077. A GPU upgrade would make for an excellent 1080p 60 FPS gaming experience even for the latest games. These products have aged very well, especially the CPU, and their prices have aged well too, assuming you're a seller. The i7-4790 is still easily over $100 used on eBay, meaning you're better off buying a new i3-10100 on Amazon. These GPUs aren't really a great choice either, selling for $80 to $90. They eat a lot of power and are getting a little bit outdated. You're much better off paying just a little more for something like an RX 470 with even more VRAM. Still, if you're considering a similar system in 2020, you can rest easy knowing that it'll be a strong casual gamer for the many years to come. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please leave a like and please consider subscribing. Thanks, and see you next time.